Our first reading this morning comes from the book of James, chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For all of us make many mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes speaking is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. If we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Or look at ships. Though they are so large that it takes strong winds to drive them, yet they are guided by a very small rudder, which wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. How great a forest is set aside by a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of nature, and is itself set on fire. For every species of bird and beast, of reptile and sea creature, can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species, but no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this ought not be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? Can a fig tree, my brothers and sisters, yield olives, or a grapevine figs? No more can salt water yield fresh. And our second reading from the Gospel comes from the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 9, verses 30 to 37. Jesus and his disciples went on from Caesarea Philippi and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Lord, may your word live within us.
And bear much fruit to your glory.
As we heard our text this morning, I don't know about you, but I know for me it brings our motivations into sharp focus. In our gospel reading, the conversation that the disciples are having is a bit the same as it was last week at the start. Jesus is sharing with the disciples as they're passing through Galilee. He's sharing with them that he will be betrayed, that he will be killed, and then he'll rise again. And we read once more that the disciples just don't get it. They don't understand what Jesus is talking about. Rather than trying to figure out what Jesus might mean about his betrayal, his killing and his rising, they've actually been arguing about who's the best one among them, who's the greatest. In response, Jesus sits down with the 12 and says to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." And then, by way of an example, he takes a little child, places the child in the middle of them and says, Whoever welcomes one such child as me welcomes me, and not only me, but the one who sent me. It seems quite obvious to us as we look back at this. We come from our own understanding of it all from thousands of years of history, and we think, what's wrong with those disciples? Why in the world can't they have understood? Why in the world would Jesus need to constantly talk to them about what was really important? And why do they keep arguing amongst themselves about all sorts of things that don't really matter? And, oh, hang on a minute. That actually does sound a bit like us, doesn't it? It might strike us as funny that the disciples are arguing about which one of them's the best, how they could decide who was going to be first, who's going to be the best mate of Jesus, who's all the sorts of arguments that go on. They are worried about status and power and title and places of honour. But think about it for a moment. These disciples are a group of 12 people, probably never chosen for anything of any great importance before. And now there are just 12 out of so many who are following Jesus, who are known as the 12. They are called by name to follow Jesus. And Jesus is becoming something of a celebrity. He teaches with authority. He goes toe-to-toe with the Pharisees. He feeds people and heals the sick wherever he goes. To be a disciple is pretty much like being in that really great inner circle. And I can see how over the course of 3 years with him, the disciples might actually start arguing, pointing out who was called first, or who does Jesus confide in the most, or who does Jesus send out more frequently, and who is it that Jesus seems to have to correct more often? Which disciple is the best? Which one is the greatest among us? I can see how that would happen because it happens in our own lives just the same. We get caught up in our own importance and we want to know where we stand in relation to everyone else around us. Well, Jesus clears this up pretty quickly. If we are to be his followers, where we stand in relation to everyone else is at the last. It's at the end of the line. It's serving others. That to some is concise and clear, but to others it makes no sense at all. And so to illustrate, Jesus brings a child into the very centre of the circle and talks about welcoming them. The child becomes at the centre and the disciples are actually pushed to the edges. Sometimes we might find it hard to understand the significance of this reading because for most of us today, children are treasured. We value children, we love children, we dote on them. And as we read these texts, we get heartwarming images in our minds. Indeed, images, paintings, pictures of this sort of text are usually ones that depict a happy, friendly Jesus bouncing some cute, rosy-cheeked child on his knee. And it always looks like a white Jesus and a white baby, which is completely out of context. Sweet, touching pictures of Jesus and children, they make us smile. But those images don't tell the whole story. They don't let us know how significant these mentions of children are, or help us understand the point that Jesus is trying to make. You see, every time we hear about the size of the crowd quoted in the Gospels, the number given is more often than not the number of men who are present in the crowd. And sometimes the text will explicitly say women and children were not counted among this because they weren't considered important enough or significant enough to count. What mattered in Jesus' day was how many adult males were present. Women were considered less important, and children even less so. Children were certainly loved. They were important because they were able to carry on a family line, and eventually they were going to provide an income. But while they were young and little and vulnerable, when so many died within the first 3 to 5 years of their life, they weren't considered particularly important. As children didn't have any social or legal standing. They had no status in society. They had no power. So when Jesus is talking about children, he's bringing to the centre of attention, to our centre of attention, a group of people that no one else is particularly interested in. Jesus is talking about people who weren't really considered worth counting, not even worth thinking about. Do you notice the beginning of a familiar theme? Jesus turns our attention once more to those who once again find themselves on the bottom of the pile, the end of the queue. He's making them the focus of his example, the object of his teaching, the important centre of attention. But the disciples, for all that Jesus had taught and shown and lived among them, were still interested just in power and prestige and status. But Jesus says the way to be first where it matters is not only to welcome those who are considered lower in status, but to serve those who have no status at all. Jesus wants us to take those who don't even count, those in our lives, our worlds who we just ignore, and place them at the centre. The only question that's left for us is, who is it who is not the centre of our attention? Who is it who's not counted? Who is it who is unseen, left on the outside, not included? Whose opinion do we count as less than our own? Think about our world and the world we live in. What is it that we love to do to ignore people who need our attention? We place them far away where we can't see them. We place them in places where we can't interact with them, where they become non-human, non-people. Or closer to home, sometimes we look at someone who has been here less years than someone else and we don't really see them. Sometimes we look at someone who's been here their entire life and yet we don't really count them. Sometimes we overlook someone because they're considered to be too young to take seriously. And sometimes we count someone out because, well, they're just too old. As a community and as a society, we can so easily be led into thinking that this group or that group are far more deserving. And I don't believe we often do that intentionally or overtly. But whenever we become very focused on making sure how things might turn out the way we want them, we're probably putting ourselves at the centre of the circle and not leaving room for someone else. This week, I encourage you to think about who we don't count, who we leave on the edges, who we don't notice. Maybe it's the person bringing food to your table, or the kitchen hand out the back cleaning up the dirty dishes. Maybe it's the person collecting your rubbish. Maybe it's the asylum seeker or the refugee that we overlook, or the teenager dressed in something that we really think, oh, should they? Jesus wants us to welcome them, to put them at the centre of our attention. And the only way we can do that is to take ourselves out of the centre, out of the middle, and take a spot on the edge so that there might be room for someone else to take up our attention, the ones who don't get counted. And then, and only then, can we really begin to serve those whom God has given us. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not only me, but the one who sent me. Amen.